introductions on this, and then I'll go through a bit more housekeeping, and then hopefully we can ask some questions and start the hearing. So on our side, I'm Deputy Alex Curtis, a panel member acting as chair.
Deputy David Waugh.
David Johnson, the Constable St Mary, I'm a panel member.
Deputy Sam Mesek, Minister for Housing.
Natasha Day, Head of Strategic Housing and Regeneration.
Heather McManus, I am the Critical Support Team Manager from Customer and Local Services.
I'm Michelle Humphreys-Foot, I'm the Head of Regulatory Improvement and Licensing.
Fantastic. And just for everyone's awareness, this is like all quarterly hearings and public hearings streamed live. And I can say that we believe this, should everything be going well, is the first time this is being streamed live on YouTube as well. So welcome to the to those tuning in on the YouTube platform.
A day for the history books.
There we go. We're making history. For those who have been here less frequently, could all devices be on off or silent? And I would ask that the members of the public who have arrived today don't interfere with proceedings. And of course, when we finish the meeting, if you could just leave straight away. And when we do speak again for the first time, if you could present your name, just so that people who see it again and can't read it on the screen are aware. So with that, Minister, we will move on to a few questions, if you don't mind. And the first one is around the government plan. Of course, we're getting very close, we believe, to the lodging of a government plan. And we're really interested in how successful you feel you've been in securing the necessary funding arrangements to address your ambition of solving and addressing Jersey's housing crisis.
Well, we're not done yet. It's not been lodged, it isn't finished, so I reserve an ultimate view until then. What I can say, though, is that following the CSP being adopted and constructed, that's been a driving force for the agenda that the government's been focusing on in recent weeks and guiding, of course, the government plan process as well. There's lots of very good stuff in there that I'm very pleased to support, and not just in my portfolio, but across government. I'm very pleased to be able to do that. So it's a slightly cop-out answer, but we will have to wait and see exactly what's in there. I can't give away spoilers at this point.
No spoilers at all.
Indeed, but I've had good conversations with the Chief Minister, including very recently, about some of the priorities I'm looking to pursue. But I would just iterate, though, that a lot of the stuff that I'm focusing on is not stuff that's particularly expensive. The stuff that I'm focusing on in terms of law changes, regulation changes, etc. That's stuff that doesn't cost a lot to deliver. It's it's not massive expenditure or anything like that. It's more about how we do housing. That's my priority.
Okay, but is that to say you've looked to bring in a conversation to government plan debates or workshops that do look for larger funding as well, or has it been kind of a breadth? Because the panel, I think, is interested to know from a policy perspective where you ideally are trying to direct some kind of plans for 2025. Mm-hmm. So
I mean, the big ticket items are not my portfolio. The expensive stuff that that's going to be the kind of things that people spot right away because of the size of the number next to it is not stuff to do with my portfolio. So I think a lot of our time has been spent focusing on those items. Living wage in particular is obviously a hugely important one, so we spent a reasonable amount of time on that. The housing stuff, to be perfectly honest, I don't think we have spent a huge amount of time around the table debating it because it's not particularly contentious politically, whatever wing of politics you're on, that we need to deliver more homes. And the stuff that probably is a bit more politically contentious is the policy stuff, and that's not a big expensive item or anything. That's about how we do things rather than what amount of money we're spending.
Right. So for the lower, so it sounds like a lot of the things you're asking for are lower ticket items from a cost. Do you feel you've been successful in articulating the kind of the bang for buck that you're trying to get with that by moving the dial on the housing crisis? And do you think you've been successful in articulating that message to ministers?
I feel so at this point. I mean, we're not finished yet. No. And to be perfectly honest, having been through this process a lot of times previously, putting government plans together, I think, to be perfectly honest, the moment that the government plan is passed and agreed, I think lots of people don't realise what they're signing up for often, and when the detail eventually comes, that's when the kind of heat starts. And the great example of that was the rented dwellings licensing scheme, where there were successive government plans that were adopted that had all the funding put aside for delivering on that, and multiple times the Assembly went on to say no to doing those things, even though it had been part of the wider plan that we would go on and deliver that. So, to be honest, I think the heat comes later than the government plan itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was hoping to ask what kind of funding that islanders might expect to see in the government plan. It sounds like you said you will be a little coy for now.
I'm afraid I will be, yeah.
But given you said that a lot of it will be the lower budget element and a lot of policy, do you see within your portfolio a longer term element of planning for successive government plans that might require higher funding? And what would those proposals, and have you looked at what those proposals maybe for the government plan of 2026 might be?
No.
So you're not looking that far forward?
Not me, no.
Okay. And so then, really, before we move on to some of the topics that we've given you the headings for, we'd love to have, as a panel, a bit more information about the approach you've decided to take on your policy making and your engagement with the public. Would you be able to share, perhaps, an overview as to what your approach is for engagement?
So I've made the effort to engage on a kind of informal, sometimes one-to-one level, as often as I can with stakeholder groups that I think will be interested. And I've spent a large amount of my time since taking office meeting all sorts of various different groups, some of those with connections to government, some of those less so. I've also been keen to be as transparent as possible about what the changes I'm looking to deliver look like, so that I'm clear with the public, this is what I stand for, and not, here's a bunch of ideas and I'm not going to tell you what I think about them, or not nail my colours to the mast. So I obviously, a few weeks ago, published a statement on where we got to with the residential tenancy law. The purpose of that for me was to be absolutely clear, this is what we're looking right now. So this is how I'm framing the debate. And I've gone out and made the case for those things. I've not kind of let it out to see how it's land. I've let it out and then have gone and advocated for it. So one example of that was that I attended the Jersey Landlords Association AGM. I spoke at that. I made the case for my policy programme and then took questions after. And I think engaging in those kind of fora is a thing that I'm very willing to do and excited to do. And if you're looking for something to do next week, I'll be the guest speaker at the Chamber of Commerce lunch as well, where I'll be doing the same thing there.
Okay. I think we would like to touch more on some of that engagement on the residential tenancy law in a later section, if that's okay. But we'd like to move on to the delivery of new homes. And we did ask you about this last quarter. So as we're approaching the end of the second quarter of this government, how successful would you say the Council of Ministers has been in progressing the delivery of new homes for islanders?
So there's a lot of homes that are currently being delivered right as we speak, and I've had the pleasure of seeing some of the homes that have been under construction for a while come online and people starting to move into them, the Limes in particular. I've had the pleasure of showing government representatives from the Isle of Man that as well, to show them how we do this. That has been a success. People are moving into those homes, some for rent, some for buy. Andy is still on site delivering 619 homes. The vast majority of those are in town, around about the same kinds of areas. I've been engaging with the States Jersey Development Company about the homes that they had the ambition to build anyway, but what we can do to make sure that they are safeguarded for the right people, to make sure we get the best use out of them and direct those who most need them to them. And I'm pleased with how that's going. I'll still be a bit coy on that as well, because on some of that we're not ready to make the announcements, but I've dedicated a reasonable amount of my time to doing that. We, of course, also get developers from the private sector who are seeking to build homes as well, who are required in some instances to engage with us about what homes they're delivering. And so we obviously, you want to do that thing as quickly as you can so they've got certainty and they can get on with it, but you also want to make sure the feedback you're providing is the right feedback to get the best outcomes for islanders. To be honest, we perhaps have a slightly easier time of this than we otherwise might have, because the context we find ourselves in today is quite different to when the Bridging Island Plan was approved in terms of the projections there were for what kind of housing need we required and what pressure we'd inevitably meeting about particular issues and sites. So there is some dialogue going on there anyway.
Okay. The Minister for Housing isn't actually referenced a huge amount in the Bridging Island Plan, as you say, that the lead is the Minister for Environment, but one place it is in Proposal 22, which is the Residential Delivery and Management Strategy, which says, the Minister for Housing and Communities will also explore, with others as appropriate, how developments of new homes might be expedited, including the use of prefabricated methods of construction. So the panel is interested in a review of how these proposals more widely with the Minister for Environment are being progressed. Mm-hmm. But how are you progressing on that, or where do you see opportunities? Have you had the support you need?
So being perfectly honest, that's not an area that I'm enthusiastic to spend huge amounts of my time on. I kind of think that the people who are actually physically developing homes will be far better informed on that kind of thing than I will. And my approach, I guess, is kind of let them get on with it. Andy, obviously, the Limes use new methods of construction with that to kind of test how it works. I think that's been really successful. And just the feedback I've had from people who've moved into those homes, and I've been around them myself, has been really positive. So if Andy, having been through that experience building homes in that kind of way, want to roll that out a bit more widely, then they'd have my support for that. But I've never quite felt that it's right for the housing minister, a politician, to be telling people who are actually the ones on the ground with the spades in their hands what to do there. That I think it's better to listen to them, and if there's things getting in the way of them doing more of that kind of thing, that's the point that we listen.
Okay, so you're quite clear that kind of how you build is something that perhaps the developers know and is not a worthwhile use for government officials' time to be. Not
a huge amount. I kind of think that, again, it's one of those things that's not going to be that contentious. Who's going to argue that we ought to build homes more slowly and more expensively when there are other options available? Nobody's going to make that political argument. And when developers are, perhaps experimenting or looking into new ways of doing it, it's better for government to support them where possible. But they know better than we do on that.
There is a wider element to this proposal as well. So that's the kind of the construction methods, but it's still within your kind of remit or purview as to how can you expedite the delivery of homes, which could be elements far more in government control. Have you had conversations with the Minister of Environment about perhaps a check in line with his reforms to the planning service, whether there's an element that you want to see changed there to expedite home delivery?
I think not necessarily as a general thing, but on particular sites, there are conversations that are happening about what's the best vision for those sites, and the sooner you have that vision, the sooner you then get on and go ahead with it. And it has been a big frustration, certainly in previous years, where government hasn't been clear about what it wants for a particular site, and sometimes even has been clear and then at the 11th hour has changed their mind on what ought to happen with a site. And that, particularly for our delivery agents like Andy, that can be hugely frustrating for them because they can dedicate resource to a particular vision or a plan for a site, only to then have the government change its priorities or even not change them, but put a question mark over it temporarily. The great example of this was Ann Court, the Cyril Markham Court as it is now, where they really were ready to put spades in the ground when the then government said, "Ooh, what about putting the new government office there instead?" So I spend a reasonable amount of my time trying to manoeuvre through that and to try to keep people steady and make sure that Antium gets certainty so that it gets best use of its time going ahead with all that.
So, and you mentioned this being specific sites, Ancourt being a historic example. Do you see, to what extent do you see that specific site lens being on just state-owned entities, rezoned housing sites, or privately owned sites? That could be what one might call a windfall site where new development can occur. Could it be all of them? Would you want to support looking at expediting private developments outside of rezoned sites?
Yes, most of that would be the Environment Minister that would have the power to do the things that would make that most easier. But then there are sites that they do have to have the feedback from the Housing Minister in terms of the tenure of homes or the types of homes. And so when that feedback is required, we've got to make sure we do that as quickly as possible and are clear of our expectations in whatever we feed back to them as well, so that they're not inadvertently going down a path just misunderstanding what we might have expected from it.
Okay, and then touching on those powers, as you say, the Minister of Environment holds those powers. At the last panel meeting, you mentioned obviously looking to meet with the Minister for Infrastructure and Environment to progress some of the obstacles preventing new home delivery on rezoned sites in particular. How have those conversations gone?
Yeah, I don't think they've been in particular in too much depth. I think subsequent to that, the Environment Minister did put something out on planning changes that he was driving forward that I was happy to say, yeah, great, get on with that. Doesn't need to slow that down until he's got my permission or anything like that. So they've not been too in depth, to be honest. No.
Are you going to continue kind of putting pressure on ministers who have power to, in essence, release sites? Especially the Infrastructure Minister, I think, is one you've highlighted.
Yes, but to be honest, I think that he's quite keen to do that himself anyway. So we are kind of singing from the same hymn sheet there.
Okay, great. I'll pass on
Still under the general heading of delivery of homes. You recently stated that the regeneration steering group will be re-established. If it has, what is the membership of that group, please? And can you give us an indication of how any initial discussions went?
So I've not attended anything from it yet. Do you know the membership?
So I can confirm that the Regeneration Steering Group has been re-established under its original terms of reference, which relate to P73 2010. So it's articulated in that decision, the membership. It does not directly include the Minister for Housing as part of its day-to-day membership, neither does it include the Minister for the Environment, which I think is a key difference of the RSG today as what was the Future Places Ministerial Group, that the previous government established that it did have a wider remit.
So, leading on from that, are you seeking to amend its constitution or its constituent members so you do have an involvement?
I'm not personally pushing for that, but I expect that I will be tapped into from time to time from it. There was a reference in the waterfront proposition in the Assembly the other day about that group and myself, so I'd imagine that from time to time there'll be collaboration.
So you don't see that, you don't see your absence or your non-presence as being a handicap to its work? Okay. On another group, something called the Housing Crisis Emergency Task Force, which was established in February this year. That it did at one time, we're told, meet weekly. Is that still the case?
Still the case, yeah. Generally, I think there's been maybe one or two where we haven't, yeah.
Right, and earlier on in this meeting you referred to perhaps weren't as much pressure as before. Does that apply equally to that committee, or?
No, so that focuses not as much getting into the granular detail of sites and delivery of homes on those sites. A lot of that focuses on the policy elements that we need to get changed and need to get in force. It regularly feeds back to me on how the licensing scheme has been introduced and any issues that are coming up from the regulation team. So I get data presented to me at every one of those meetings, so we can look to see if there are particular problems arising that we need to react to. And the Housing Advice Service as well feeds into that every week. So again, if there are I'll call them like little emergencies, so particular pockets of problems that need a response or need direction on. Those are fed into that meeting every time. So it's
So the licence scheme, is that the standards?
the rented dwellings licensing scheme.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're involved in that to some extent then? It's not entirely a Minister of Environment then?
So he's made, he's the one with the powers and the one who officially makes all of the decisions, but I have been actively supporting him in that. I've been advocating for the scheme, and I've attended there were public meetings at some of the parish halls that I made sure to attend and be available for. There was a good meeting with the Landlords Association, which I attended as well. So it's the Minister for Environment scheme, but I completely support it and have just offered my voice or any action I can. But also, not everybody out there recognises it as a scheme that belongs to the Minister for the Environment. Plenty of people think it belongs to the Minister for Housing, so I do get people come to me with those issues, and so it's important that I can link into that and direct that, and also different types of landlords that have just needed clarity on that scheme. So okay, there's your ordinary landlord, but then there are types of corporate landlords. There's the parishes that act as landlords as well sometimes. So some of that has ended up coming to me, so I can use that as a forum for getting that dealt with too.
And going back to your general meetings, as it were, I mean, are they recorded formally, and how are they published, and how can the public know what decisions are made?
Yeah, so we have minutes. I don't think they're published. That would be something to consider. I don't think they're published. No. Okay.
Would you, as we're on that theme, do you have any objection to them being published?
Not particularly, but then we might at that point want to think about an A and B agenda kind of situation, because there will be lots of policy under development that's discussed there, and some of that is not appropriate to be put in the public domain whilst it's still.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, moving on to a different item. The Les Sables on site. The Chief Minister indicated that agreement had been reached with the developer, which would allow development of the site to progress. Is that the case? And can you provide any information as to the form of the agreement?
So we've agreed in principle, and the liaising is going on just to cross the T's and dot the I's for a planning application agreement. That will then be the moment where that's 100% formally agreed and they can legally go on with it. But we met in person and discussed the various different options there were for satisfying the intentions behind the policy on affordable housings on that site, and we came to a common view on a good way to deliver that. I'm cautious about saying exactly what that involves because it hasn't been signed, and it's their agreement too, so we want to agree with ourselves when we spill the beans on the exact detail of that. But it satisfies the requirements in the policy on delivering affordable housing there.
Okay, thanks for that. And as you're getting near to the conclusion of the planning obligation agreement, are you able to indicate when that might be signed, at which time presumably the public will know what's in it?
I think is it to the end of the month we've got to formally sign that off, but it's hopefully imminently.
Okay. I think you already indicated talks with other developers, but can you provide examples of practice steps that have been taken to work with developers to bring forward new homes? Are there any particular ones, or is it just a general agenda you have of chasing them up?
Yeah, so some of them proactively approach us because they know that they need to. I got a handful of those quite early on in this, where it was required that I fed into that process. Some of that was coming directly to me, where I kind of think that kind of thing is appropriate to start at an officer level rather than coming straight to me. And that's gone well. Some of those have been approved. There's consistently, most weeks, stuff getting put on my desk to do with that I have to go through and either tweak or approve as it is. But that's a business as usual kind of thing. That's
so in the context of what you were saying earlier, that you're quite relaxed is the wrong word, but you're actually pleased with development and liaison with developers as to bringing forward new sites.
Yeah, generally, I think you do get the odd one that you look at and think, this has probably missed the mark here a bit, and have to provide that feedback, which may or may not be welcome. But generally speaking, I've seen some stuff that I've been quite pleased with, especially when there were policies introduced in the Bridging Island plan, like play space for children, like that kind of thing. I've been reasonably pleased at what developers have just kind of been coming up with anyway on that. But I do provide feedback on things like room layout, whether places are, I think, designed to give the best quality of life. I sometimes look at a floor plan and think, where does the telly go? Like little things like that, if the room isn't designed in a way that you can actually enjoy the space. Well, so that kind of thing. But and I've also had ones very recently where a developer's been conscious of their affordable housing obligations, and they've come forward very proactively on that to say this is what we think we can do. So that expectation permeating that way is a good thing for developers to kind of know this is what the deal is now. So,
in fact, you partially answered my next question, was about the influence you might bring on the mix of housing in particular. That's a major part of your input, presumably, and you were able to influence that.
Yeah, definitely, and comments are provided on that. Yeah.
Okay.
Could I just jump in and ask about what proportion, especially on those sites where developers are coming to you because they're a rezoned site? I think roughly, was it 16 or so sites were rezoned? How many are outstanding where dialogue's not started yet?
Most of them
are outstanding.
Yeah.
Okay. Does that concern you?
It doesn't necessarily concern me, because I know that none of this happens overnight anyway. No, it doesn't. We'll see where we go with it. But I didn't expect everything to come forward on day one. That was never going to happen.
But the Bridging Island plan does indicate a timeline for kind of achieving this, and in the policy it says sites that have not brought forward applications within 3 years of the commencement of the plan may be liable to compulsory purchase. Would you be supportive of that if sites are clearly not coming forward to deliver on homes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that's in the plan. It's because it's a reasonable option if it needs to be. I wouldn't suggest doing it for the sake of it, or doing it arbitrarily when a good solution might actually just be a little bit further round the corner. You'd have to think about each of those specifically, but it's in the plan for a reason.
Okay.
Yeah, turning to financing of new homes, can you outline any conversations you have with the Treasury Minister, or maybe even with mortgage providers, about terms which are being offered to borrowers, or is that not within your remit?
You're looking at ordinary people buying homes.
Yes.
So we haven't all sat together around a table following some of the feedback we had about the mortgage situation. That will ultimately be the ministers with responsibility for financial services, who again I think we're on the same page as on that, but we haven't yet sat around a table to say, right, is there anything government specifically needs to do on that?
Okay, and leading on from that, what about the Treasury Minister? Has she been in touch with lenders as to possible terms as well? Are you aware of that, or are you involved?
I'm not specifically aware. I'd have to ask her.
And going back to your earlier answer, then, would it be helpful for those involved in the ministers involved in the provision of finance to have a common policy to sit around the table, as you suggest?
Yeah, I think that would be a useful thing to do. Yeah. And I'm happy to propose that to them and say, can we catch up properly on this? And yeah.
Okay. Thanks. That I think is.
Then I think we're going to move on to a new topic, which would be the residential tenancy law. So we've got a few questions here, and the College will kick off again.
Yes, you got me again. Yes, as you're aware, the panel will be conducting a full review of the tenancy law when it is lodged, but we'd first like to explore some of the policy areas contained in the document published earlier. There you commit to consulting in a focused way with a clear purpose in mind, so the contribution people make can generally inform the contents of the new law. You already touched on this, but can you again elaborate on the engagement you have with people that will be involved in the law?
Yeah, so landlord stakeholders are obviously a key part of that. I have been in regular dialogue with the leadership there to say where my thoughts were going on this, and I've been, I think, quite open with them as those thoughts have been developing and sometimes changing along the way as well. So that I've kind of got a no surprises position with them, and I shared with them the statement that I put out before it was officially put out, so they were ready for that. I'm kind of in early stages of discussions with other groups that may want to feed into that process as well. I had a good meeting with Shelter Trust recently where I kind of want a bit more feedback from them on this as well. So it's not a big open opinion poll or anything like that. It's specifically me targeting those who I think will have a constructive contribution to make, and sitting with them and saying, right, how do we, saying these are the policies, and I'm the minister, I'm the one with the democratic mandate, and that's the direction to go in. But in terms of the particulars and some of the finer detail underpinning it, that's the area that I want the feedback from them on.
Okay, and have you identified any major concerns from any particular group?
So there's plenty of different opinions, and I think lots of misunderstandings about some of what's proposed in there as well. The main issue that particularly landlords will be concerned about is when the time comes and I need to get possession of my property back, how do I do it? That's the key thing. And I need to construct something within the policy that I've put together that aims to be as clear as possible, so that those who are renting out homes know what that framework is and know what the rules are and how they would go about addressing an issue if they came up with it. And in constructing that system, I need to speak with them to say, right, what are the clauses you might need put in there to give you that certainty? What are the exemptions that might need to be made for particular things? So that's a totally understandable area of concern for them, and that I imagine will be a big part of the kind of focused engagement I have, will be on that issue of how does a landlord get a property back when the moment comes and they need it back.
Yes, I mean that's been on the agenda for the Landlords Association for some time. I mean, how near have you got in developing that to something which you think might be, let's say, acceptable but understandable?
So I'm not after acceptable. I believe that what I propose will not command universal support. There will be people out there who like the free-for-all that the current system provides, and I'm making a political direction that I don't want that free-for-all. I want the abolition of no-fault evictions and revenge evictions, and that means changing the rules. So I expect there'll be an element of contention in there. So my mission is to be clear in any of the misunderstandings can be dealt with. So apologies if I brought this up at the last hearing, but there's an anecdote I often refer back to where a landlord approached me, very friendly, but said I couldn't support your policy because I think that if it were implemented would stop me from repossessing my property, which I intend to retire into later in my life. And then I explained to him, but retiring into your property would be one of the exemptions I'm planning to put in that law, so you would be allowed to reclaim your property. And that guy went, oh, fine, okay, no problem then. So with a minute-long conversation, I managed to explain to someone what I was actually proposing and what it meant for them, and he was pretty relaxed about it afterwards. So there'll be lots of those kind of conversations and those practical examples that I'll have to show how what I'm proposing applies to that, so people get clarity for it. But there will be instances where people won't like what I propose, and I'm just going to have to make the political case for it.
Okay. And given that there are ongoing concerns, there will be until the draft legislation is produced, when do you propose to update the Assembly and indeed ourselves on the basic proposals?
So I put that statement out a few weeks ago specifically to be clear about what I'm looking at, and that that's that new tenancy type that would be without a specified end date as default, but with a potential fixed term at the start of it, if that's what either side wants to do. So that's now on the table, and I'm clear that that is what I think the solution to this is. So the discussions are now around that and the detail around it. And I'm open about that now. That was relatively recent, so I don't anticipate the next thing will be imminent. That may be a couple of months or something like that before we're ready to say, okay, and this is the next point of how you implement that and some of the more finer detail underpinning that.
So by the end of the summer recess, we might see a draft proposition, aren't we?
A draft proposition, or draft legislation.
Or draft legislation, yes.
Draft legislation, I think, might be a bit longer than that. Yeah.
Okay.
Could I, just before Contal continues, just check in on that kind of, you mentioned your ideas and proposals won't be universally adopted, but you felt you had a democratic mandate to pursue this. How have the conversations gone with the Council of Ministers on your proposals? Do they support your mandate, as you say, or have you got their unanimous support, or is it equally not universally?
Oh, I'm not expecting it to be unanimous. I didn't. So the Council of Ministers discussed the statement before it was published, and we went through it and had questions. It was a really good discussion, and members unanimously supported my right to put that statement out and go ahead with it. I didn't look at every face around the table and say, and when it comes to it, will you be voting in favour of this? Because that's not quite the approach that the new Chief Minister is taking politically. He's not holding the whip as firmly as some political leaders might choose to. So I've not asked, and I do anticipate that there will be people who are with me on some subjects who won't be on all of this. I would quite like to present things in such a way where it's not a take it or leave it for all of it. I think if there are elements that can stand alone, where I might build one coalition in support of this part and another coalition in support of this part, that might be part of how I seek to go about implementing it.
Yeah, returning to the enhanced security of tenure, which you referred to where you said that you anticipate problems. I mean, have you identified all the potential problems and your remedies to appease the landlords? Is that an ongoing discussion? Is there much more to do on that? I would have thought by now maybe all the problems might have been identified.
Maybe they have. Maybe no more will come up from this point, but I'm still open to that discussion. I do have another meeting, I think, with the Landlords Association in the diary relatively soon. I can't remember exactly what day. Oh, I think it's next Wednesday, actually. I think I'm due to meet them again. So we'll go through a bit more at that point too. But yeah, I'm not expecting to come up with a package that commands universal support from every stakeholder group, but I'm going to do my bit to say I've done everything I can to address every potential loophole, every potential concern in this, and I will make the political case for it at that point.
Okay, well, until you've had your further meetings, I'm not sure you do much more on that one. Okay. Yes, fine. It's probably an on point now in a way. Over the period, you mentioned one example where you managed to satisfy a concerned landlord. I mean, have there been many examples like that where the attitude of the landlords has been able to be appeased or accommodated?
Yeah, I mean, I have lots of conversations with various people, and I like to think that I'm persuasive and can make the case for my policy. When other people caricature my policy, that hurts and that makes things more difficult because people then have a misunderstanding of what's being proposed that they can get entrenched on because they're worried, which is totally understandable. But when I go and I say, no, this is what it means, your particular concern, this is how that would apply in the framework that I'm proposing. And I do find the more I have those conversations, the more people understand what's being proposed and the more they come to say, okay, that's not too bad. I'm also in the fortunate position tomorrow in that whoever wins the UK election has the same policy as me when it comes to no-fault evictions, because both main parties in the UK are proposing abolishing Section 21 of the Housing Act in the UK, and I'm suggesting an equivalent thing here. So, it being on the agenda up there probably helps as well.
I think I finished
Okay,
that.
well, I think, Minister, you've already started covering some of the areas I wanted to dive into, so I would like to see if we can still explore some of that approach to frameworks still. And you've mentioned that kind of, the caricature is quite challenging, but when you explain it to people, your experience has been most people are quite happy. So how is that really forming into a framework? What process are you following to say, actually, you gave the example of this concept of exemptions, and if that's what you're going to pursue, we really want to, as a panel, understand more the look and feel, and if you're not ready, obviously, to show us legislation, we really want to know what that process feels like for you, kind of feeling out what's appropriate, forming that and framing that into something that clearly, for you now, is so clear that when you speak to someone, kind of assuage their fears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question.
Your mind on this framework for exemptions, or this framework for how a tenancy can be ended or can conclude is quite clear in your mind, it feels.
Yeah.
But it sounds like to most people it's not. And that's frustrating to you when it gets caricatured and you go, well, I've got this clear idea, I think it's fair, I think it's appropriate. So what I'm trying to ask is, can you explain to us how that looks and feels in the same way you could to someone else, given you mentioned loopholes, nuances, bona fide reasons. How's this all going to come together?
Yeah, so there will eventually be legislation that says this is what the Jersey tenancy looks like, this is what it must include, this is what it can't include, this is what the terms look like, which we already have to a degree in the current residential tenancy law. It's just that what I'll be proposing will be different to what's in that current law. And we still need to get advice on the best way of putting that on paper, but it may well be that there is a schedule attached to the legislation that says, and in these circumstances, this is what you would do to go about ending a tenancy, and these are the reasons you must cite, and when you issue notice, this is the form in which it needs to take. The law already says that at the moment, but it would be slightly different under what I would be proposing. So I'm due to receive a paper by the end of this week that will that has some of the options on what particular legal mechanism we take to get some of that in force, and then I will kind of have a bit clearer in my head then exactly what those mechanisms look like, and therefore I can, when I've resolved on that, when I'm having those conversations, engaging with stakeholder groups or whatever, I can then be a bit clearer to say, okay, we've done a bit more of the work on this. This is what that process will look like. How does that sound?
Okay. So hopefully by our next quarterly hearing or a briefing on the matter, you'll be in a position to update us as to
yes,
as to how that feels.
Yeah, definitely.
And in your mind at the moment, do you see it as appropriate to provide appeals to ministers? Have you thought about kind of the logistics as to how to make this align with making government processes smooth and low bureaucracy, such as the CSP says? Have you thought about appeals? Have you thought about handling where a schedule wouldn't offer every case foreseeable?
Yeah, so the Rent Tribunal is obviously part of those that package of measures, and that would be a point for which certain specified, whether they're disputes or something else, that would be the specified route to that. So we would need to be clear about what those issues that you take to that body are. Who is on that body, how you approach them. What's the email address or whatever. But that I think that's been clear for a while, that a body of some sort that people go to would kind of be the known place.
So you envisage the rent tribunal perhaps having some powers over, for example, the ending or closure of a tenancy in arbitrating against the schedule. And
Okay, so honestly, early on, no. At the moment, the Petty Debts Court is the body that deals with eviction cases and would deal with disputes. So that body is already competent to do that. We might change some of the rules or specifications, but that they're already doing that job and could theoretically do that for longer. The job, I think, in the shorter term that would be more likely to be taken on by the Rent Tribunal would be the rent stabilisation stuff, because I'm proposing that a mechanism is put into law that specifies the maximum amounts that rents can go up and how often they can go up. But there will need to be exemptions from time to time. And having a body that can adjudicate on that, that's probably the first part of getting that up and running. So that's the thinking at the moment.
okay, so that rent tribunal, have you looked to put provision for funding for that in the forthcoming government plan?
I don't think so. I don't. Where are we on that? Yeah.
So I think it really falls down to what form of body it is. So in looking at the original Housing Tribunal proposals that were being pursued under the last government, it was quite clear that that was becoming quite an unwieldy, potentially a very bureaucratic, large function. So now that we have a narrower function, narrower focus on the Rent Tribunal, and it's serving a purpose in testing rent stabilisation, you can think about what is the appropriate format for that body. So tribunal in the traditional sense, you would think about the tribunal service and the functions that align to that service. But a body that tests appropriateness of rent levels doesn't need to be necessarily a tribunal. It can be a group of professionals that are drawn on from time to time. It may even have political representation on that group. So what we're working through at the moment is just the format of the rent control, rent stabilisation measures, and how that best translates into an adjudicating body to test those stabilisation measures. So it may not come with a cost at all.
Just leading on from the Chair's point, I mean, there were 2 points. The Rent Tribunal, I mean, you're going to have strikes me that's not been sort of, I don't mean rudely, thought through to the end if you're thinking about professional bodies rather than tribunal itself. One concern I have is that, I mean, the Chief Minister is reviewing the Ombudsman situation on the basis of cost or partly on that. I just wonder whether, on a similar basis, you might think Rent Tribunal is too costly for the moment.
We can do something low cost at the moment if we choose to. The Petty Debts Court, that is an existing body, existing funding, doing the same job but citing a different law. That is competent to do elements of that. We can, if we choose to, set up a rent tribunal. Call it a tribunal, but it might not sit with the rest of the tribunal services. And that would also be low cost, because that would have officers supporting it who are already in government doing a job. And you could, if you wanted, have professional volunteers to do that. There are ways of doing it low cost that get something up and running and working. And then if you wanted in the future to consolidate it differently, you've got the breathing space to do that and time to come back if it's going to have funding consequences. But
so you anticipate it not being an independent body, independent of government, what you say, you have officers there?
Mm-hmm. I would anticipate it being led by people who are independent from government, but they would be appointed in the same way that we appoint lots of people to various tribunals that exist.
Okay. But my final point on this is, I may well be out of date, certainly when I practiced law in the UK, there was the Rent Tribunal there it did not have jurisdiction where the property was rate for value was more than a certain amount, on the basis, I think, that they were there to protect those at the lower end of the scale in rental terms. Have you considered anything like that on the basis that those wealthy enough can afford their own legal representation rather than having to rely on a tribunal, or would that cut out some of the work?
No, I don't. I don't quite understand how that would work in the Jersey context. I think the point is for it to be as not an adversarial body and a body that people can freely choose to go to, whether it's the landlord who needs an exemption from rent stabilisation or a tenant who feels they've had a rent rise imposed on them that isn't in line with the rules, that they can approach to that. But for that to be as user friendly as possible, I wouldn't want people turning up with advocates to that kind of thing. You'd want it to be as user friendly as
trying
possible.
to lessen the burden on the basis
Yeah.
on the basis that what you're really trying to protect is those perhaps less able to represent themselves. That
Yeah.
Those technically could have you could have a rental agreement with a 1E person who might not possibly be your first concern. Let's say on the basis that they can afford and may well sort of, by virtue of the value of the property, exempt themselves from the service offered. But you're not contemplating that.
No, I don't think so. I don't think I'd want people exempted from it. The only potential alternative there might be social housing, where there might be a framework, because social housing has a specific rents policy that has elements to it that you wouldn't copy in the private sector. So how social housing fits into it is, I think, the only exemption I'm thinking about at this point.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. Well, turning to a few other things in your proposals, and as you say, the kind of the letter the looking forward letter. You mention notice periods. So, would you be able to provide a bit more detail on the changes you anticipate to notice periods?
Yeah, I've had a long held position that if you are living in a home that is your long-term home, then the arrangements for security of tenure that you have in that home ought to reflect the fact it's your long-term home and not somewhere that you're just stopping off at for a few months or a year. I think that if you have lived somewhere for a long time in a rental home that has become, the place you brought your children up, the place you have all of your caring responsibilities dealt with, the neighbourhood that you're involved in, etc. If a reason occurs that you can't live there any longer because the landlord needs to take possession of it back, then the notice period that's offered to you should be commensurate to how long that you've lived in that property, so that you've got extra time that you need to re-establish your life somewhere else, which if you've lived somewhere a long time can be a difficult thing to do. I think if you've lived somewhere for a decade, being given 3 months notice is not that much. And in other jurisdictions, they offer longer notice periods the longer somebody has left there. If you're a landlord that's seeking to take possession of your property back for a legitimate reason, which might be that you need to refurbish it significantly and nobody can live in there whilst it's happening, it might be because you're choosing to retire into it yourself, etc. You can plan to do that. You can book that well in advance in the diary if you need to, and a longer notice period for you is not an inconvenience in the same way that a short notice period might be for somebody who all of a sudden out of the blue has been told their life is being turned upside down by their home no longer being available for them.
So you see this playing hand in hand with the element of, as you say, protection against no-fault eviction. So it's still, regardless as to when that tenancy will end, when it ends, you want to see a longer notice period.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, not obviously for people who've broken their tenancy agreements and are trashing the place or refusing to pay rent or whatever. That is a false eviction, as far as I'm concerned. But if you're someone who was just living your life and it's just your landlord's circumstances have changed, then there ought to be justification for it and a notice period that's commensurate to the inconvenience and difficulty that it'll cause you.
And you mentioned other jurisdictions do this, and you said you liked what they do. I think. Where does this and what kind of schedule do they work towards? Is it 1 month for every year? Is it what have you seen that you like that's giving you inspiration?
Ireland has a very clear schedule. It's based on how long you've lived there. If you've lived there X number of years, your notice period is X number of months, etc. But in European countries, there are quite wide differences on the specifics. There are some places where you have quite a generous set of reasons why a tenancy can be ended, and some places that have less generous ones. So in some places, you can end the tenancy because the landlord is intending to sell the property. In some jurisdictions, you can't do that. You're expected to either sell it to another landlord or sell it to the tenant who's living there. But that itself is not grounds for ending a tenancy. Just whoever buys it has to respect the fact that there's already a tenancy there. So different jurisdictions have different reasons, and some are more generous than others. So for Jersey, I've got to come up with a list of those reasons that's right for us, and hopefully will command at least enough support for people to be confident that it's fair across the board.
Yeah, sorry, depending on which model you use, is there a danger of unforeseen consequences in the sense that if a landlord feels that the longer a tenant is going to be there, more difficulty is going to remove him, he might sort of, as a matter of course, look for a new tenant every 2 years or so. I mean, that which would be self-defeating, wouldn't it? No,
because that wouldn't be... So what I'm proposing of the tenancy that has no end date as default, or a initial fixed term with the ability to then renew onto a tenancy with no fixed end date, but not to renew to another fixed term. If you have one fixed term, if you're renewing it, at that point you're renewing it to the one without a fixed term. It strikes me as a load of faff to have to kick out a tenant every couple of years and go through the expense and difficulty of finding a new one, all because you don't like the fact you'd have to specify a reason when you did eventually want that tenant to go out, even though that tenant will be paying you rent that whole time. It just doesn't strike me as a logical thing for a landlord to do. It would strike me as being against their own interest to be so convoluted like that.
I hear what you say about that.
And that's the feedback I get when I spoke at the Landlords Association. The number one bit of feedback that they said to me was, we want long-term tenants because they're paying the rent, we get good relationships with them and everybody's happy from that. They don't want to have a large turnover of tenants because it's a hassle for them and they get less money from it. So, but the problem is that now we don't have the legal framework that provides long-term tenancies. Whereas if we have that framework, then you get certainty on both sides, and you squeeze out those landlords who adopt bad practice under that framework because they can.
Do you see an upper limit to notice periods potentially? So for very long-standing tenants.
Yes. I don't know what that is yet. That's one of the details that I want to discuss with landlords and say, right, what should that upper limit for that initial fixed term be? And I'm open to that. So I want a bit of feedback, and what I think we settle on as reasonable will probably be what we go for.
I think the panel would be interested to hear how that goes. One example comes to my mind being an owner of property needs to potentially redevelop to extend, to make better provision. Permission from planning would only be for 3 years. So they would need to know if a period were greater than 3 years, they would be able to get permission, know they needed to move a tenant on for significant works, demolition or similar, but by the time the tenant had left, permission would have been lost. Can you see examples like that where you have to work within other legislative reasons for why what your exemptions, why they would also be coming into effect?
Definitely, and none of that is insurmountable within what I'm proposing. You know, if you have a property that is empty that you want to let out, and you know in 2 years' time I have to vacate this. I have to have this property vacated because there's work I need to do. I'm under a deadline, or I know that's the time I can get the builders in. You are absolutely free to say to an incoming tenant, for the record, I'm giving you the fixed term tenancy of 2 years and I will not renew it at the end for this reason. And then the tenant knows from the outset, that's the deal I'm getting. Fine, no problem. And it will end, and the law allows it to end. Fine. But if they were on the open-ended iteration of the tenancy, having to conduct a refurbishment of a property during which a tenant can't live in the property because of the nature of the work taking place, that will be a ground for ending tenancy as well. So at that point, you could issue notice and you would know in advance what that notice period will be. It might be 3 months if it's been a relatively short tenancy. If it's been 9 years, it might be 6 months or something like that. But you plan for when you get the builders in to do that work, but the legal framework will allow you to do that.
Okay, great. And so moving on to perhaps the last area of that letter and your proposals, rent stabilisation, Mr. Could you provide some more detail around the stabilisation measures you're proposing and the conversations you've had about this?
So as part of the natural order of rent adjustments, it should not be the case that a tenant can experience an unexpected inflationary rent increase that will be unjustifiable and cause them hardship, which they are forced to accept because the alternative is that they lose their home and incur all the difficulties and expenses that come with that. There ought to be a presumption that's provided for in law that rent adjustments are within the bounds of reasonableness. So the proposal is that we would limit how much rent can go up in a year. We would impose a mandatory notice period that must be given before a rent increase can take effect, and that there would be an ordinary cap on how much rent could go up in one go. The work is still to be done as to what exactly that cap would be, what metric we peg that to. There's different options. There's RPI being the obvious one, which is not so bad today, but would have been pretty rubbish in recent years when RPI has been very high. Average earnings is one metric as well. So some work to be done on what exactly that metric would be. But then that would give landlords and tenants a degree of certainty that for the course of this tenancy, there isn't going to be a sudden, unexpected and unreasonable rent increase. However, we do have to take into account the fact that from time to time something may happen that requires a more drastic rent adjustment that falls without that framework. It might be because there's been a massive investment in a property, its value has gone up, and it just is reasonable that rent is readjusted at that point. The suggestion is that there will be a process for going through that and not simply a letter saying, update your standing order, your rent's going up by this huge amount next week. There would be a process, and that would likely go through the rent tribunal, where you would have to justify why that's happening to get approval for it before you could enact it, rather than just presume you could do whatever you like.
Yeah, sorry, as a matter of interest, I fully take on board the tenant shouldn't be faced with unforeseen consequences, but I would have assumed that the vast majority of landlords build in something which would refer to an increase limited to the cost of living index. I mean, do your proposals come out from experiences where there are a large number of people that don't have that benefit?
Definitely. So you're right that lots will build it into their contracts already. So lots of landlords will already be under voluntary rent control because that's just part of the contract. Some might choose to offer it anyway. It is also already part of the Jersey Standard tenancy agreement, which exists somewhere on a government website.
We don't know where they're doing.
Sorry?
I'm not sure we know where, do we? That came up in the States. Sorry.
Yeah, you can Google it and it will come up somewhere, but yeah, it's a journey to get to it. But it does exist, and if you want to copy and paste it and use it as your tenancy, you're free to do so, and it has a rent control clause in it, and that would be what you could use.
Minister, as a point of clarity, it is on the Landlord's Toolkit on gov.je. There is a link to the model tenancy agreement.
Okay, there was a bit of uncertainty about it when it came up for debate.
Yeah, indeed. It does exist, and landlords are free to use it, and I'm sure that some do. So for the vast majority of landlords that already have some kind of process built into their contracts, whether it's the standard one or a bespoke one, they won't notice my policy change that I'm proposing because they're already voluntarily under some kind of scheme. But it is the case that I frequently get constituents coming to me to say I've had a sudden rent increase imposed on me at short notice, and I have two choices. I either lose my home or I impoverish myself to carry on staying here. is there nothing I can do about this? And when they email me and ask that question, is there nothing I can do about this? My answer to them is yes, there is nothing you can do about it. You either have to try to negotiate, in which case you hold none of the cards in your hands there, or good luck and try and find somewhere cheaper. So we would provide that certainty that it would apply across the board and people wouldn't be faced in that terrible situation. And just for the record, I am aware of instances of landlords raising their rents more than once a year, which currently, as long as it's in line with their contract, they're allowed to do. But I know of people that, they're only getting one pay rise a year. If they're getting one at all, they're only getting it once a year, to then get 3 rent increases, some of which I believe were issued with 1 week's notice. So this behaviour does go on.
Okay, great. And you mentioned, Minister, rent control in that sentence. Could you identify the difference between rent stabilisation and rent control, just for the panel to...
They're words that mean the same thing. They mean whatever you want them to mean, and even the term rent stabilisation means whatever you want it to mean. If you say rent control, some people envisage a government bureaucrat turning up with a clipboard and telling you the maximum rent you're allowed to charge. That is, I suppose, one iteration it could be, but on the very other end of things, it's just a bit in law that caps how much rent you can increase in one go, but provides an exemption route when it's necessary. That's the kind of softer end of it. So you can call it rent control if you like. What I'm proposing is very much the softer end of rent control.
And so you've decided rent stabilisation is a good language. It's a good phrasing. It's better than rent control in your view because you've chosen it. But I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, but I think there's some precedent in other jurisdictions as well where they talk about the generations of rent control, and third generation rent control tends to be called rent stabilisation. So, yeah, it's a term that is used in other jurisdictions and reflects what I'm proposing here. So, yeah.
And you mentioned going into that model where you might go to the rent tribunal to understand whether a change is applicable, perhaps after a development. Do you foresee that being an in-person thing, or do you think many of these instances can be handled as paper exercises, as written submissions only? So log on to a website, here's my property, here's my UPRN, this is what I'm doing, and I'll get a yes or no, or more info required.
So I would anticipate in the first instance it could be a paper thing, because there may well actually be plenty of instances where the tenant doesn't contest it, where the tenant realises that ultimately it's fair, in which case there's no point in convening any kind of body to examine it any further than that, but it still needs to be registered in that way to just confirm that it has gone, that it is lawful. But when it comes to properly contesting it, then that may well be a convening of people in a room to hear the arguments on both sides.
Okay. And are you considering inter-tenancy rent stabilisation mechanisms at the moment?
No, not for brand new tenancies. But if you're transitioning from the fixed term to the non-fixed term element of it, then it would apply at that point. But no, not in between tenancies. Yeah, so it's an even softer form of rent stabilisation than exists in some places.
And lastly on this, you mentioned the various mechanisms you could use. You mentioned RPI, average earnings. Could you provide a bit more update as to what you've gone through as a process with the economics unit to work this out? Is there anything, I know you might say this is under development, but is there anything you've already discounted? No.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember what they are, because I think I threw them out of my mind because I'd discounted them. Natasha might be able to remind me on some of those, but I did get a substantial list, and there were a handful I looked at and went, no, we're not going down that road.
Yeah, so we looked at 7 options. I'm not going to attempt to list all of the iterations, but it's the RPI, which is obviously the existing. Well, first of all, we explored a counterfactual, which is you change nothing on rent controls and you keep everything as it is. What does that look like? And that's good economic analysis practice. RPI, RPIX, which is a helpful measure relative to the cost of housing. And mortgages, we looked at average earnings index, we looked at a combination of 2, whichever one is lower. And there is also another option which looks at one of the measures plus a ceiling, which helps us deal with times of high inflation, like what we saw. So if it could be RPI or X percentage, whichever is lower.
Okay.
And that is now being, so the Minister has given us his steer in relation to those options. As he said, he's discounted some immediately based on the initial assessment. That is now with the economics unit to provide us more detailed economic advice in relation to that narrower list. However, we have been working with the economics unit throughout this piece of work. It's important that they are a part of that journey.
So are we close to concluding what will go in there, would you say?
Ask me next week, because I've got this paper that I'm anticipating at the end of the week.
Brilliant.
So, yeah.
Then we'll move on, topics, we spent a bit on that, to lodging houses and Deputy Wall stuff.
So moving on from residential tenancy law, the panel would like to touch on lodging houses. The panel is aware that lodging houses are not covered by the recently launched residential tenancy licensing scheme. To what extent are the conditions and inspection of lodging houses on your radar?
So they haven't been on my radar recently because the focus very much has been on getting the rented dwellings licensing scheme and establishing a regime for that wider part of the market. Getting that right, getting it up and running and people understanding it has very much been the focus. So specifically looking at the lodging houses situation has not particularly been on my agenda thus far.
Okay, thank you. And so what's your understanding of the frequency of inspections? And I appreciate you're saying that probably over to your colleague there, undertaken, the number and nature of complaints received. So maybe I didn't.
And Michelle will be very capable of answering
that one better.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's 215 registered lodging houses. They are registered February to March. We inspected 123 of those last year. We took over the function of inspecting them in 2018 when the Public Health and Safety Rented Dwellings Law came in, and we have been inspecting to those standards. So the complaints have actually fallen because we have got a proactive inspection regime in place, and the inspections are now done on a risk basis. So we will go back on a 1, 2 or 3 year frequency depending on where we feel we need to intervene more.
Okay, thank you.
What kind of notice are you providing to lodging house owners on those inspections? And I speak having visited one and been surprised at the I'd say the poor quality of the communal areas from a health and safety perspective, and I was surprised it hadn't been picked up. So just kind of what coverage are you getting, and do you think that more focus needs to be provided, or maybe some of that might be to the Minister, but from a operations perspective?
So we work with the owners of the lodging houses to arrange the inspections. So we will proactively contact them and say we'd like to come in and suggest a date and time. Then we'll work with them to make sure it's mutually convenient and that they're giving their tenants the appropriate notice. So we do allow them to feed into the inspection. It's not a surprise inspection, as it were.
Okay, and you're quite happy with how it's working as a process? As a process,
it seems to have been working well. We have seen complaints drop because we are proactively going in, but we always will take intelligence, and if required, we will bring an inspection forward.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I think that answers the next question then. So we'll move on to homelessness. Okay. So the Minister, when you last met, you indicated that a piece of work was being done to examine the data held by government on islanders who are homeless and the reasons why. Please can you update the panel on progress in this area and whether you've drawn any conclusions on improving the service that are being provided?
So the data collection is not over at this point. I think it's still got to the end of this month, so we're anticipating getting some feedback on that. I think the Chief Statistician is going to feed back into that process as well to make sure that, that the data is all sound. I gather that the homelessness charities and providers have been feeding in to that, and I've been very pleased to be doing so and pleased to see this project going ahead. But it's not complete at this point. So right now, we can't say for definite what that data will say. But yeah, and I think it's also it will be published on a gov.je page as well.
Okay.
So the public can look at it too.
Okay. So I'm just quickly seeing if there's any questions here. I can skip very rapidly. Yeah, so the panel understands from response provided at the last hearing that other ministers were due to join you on the homelessness cluster meeting, which was taking place in May. Can you advise which ministers attended and the actions they were left with?
Okay, so there's been two. There's been two meetings. One was the homelessness cluster, which I think had the social security minister. I think had my assistant minister there. Was anyone else at that particular one?
I was there with the social security minister.
Okay. And also a couple of weeks ago was a homelessness ministerial group meeting, which had a lot of us at that. Had me, social security minister, health minister, assistant health minister, children's minister and home affairs minister as well, and some of the charity providers there. So they're technically separate groups, the cluster and the ministerial group, but there was a lot of crossover.
Okay, thank you. And are you able to provide any more information about the engagement undertaken with private sector landlords by the Housing Advice Service to understand what support could be provided to help prevent a tenant facing difficulties from becoming homeless?
There's been some brilliant work going on for this, and I can hand over to Heather to give some detail.
Yeah, we've successfully rolled out our Supporting Sustainable Tenancy scheme to the Jersey Landlord Association and looking to proactively work with them to prevent homeless positions and provide appropriate support to keep people sustainably housed. It's a real bespoke piece of work. It's person-centred. It's designed around the person in need with our wants, wishes in mind, that fits both purposes, works for the person and works for the landlord.
Okay, thank you. Okay, right sizing policy.
Brilliant, yes. That will be taken by the Policy Office.
Oh, there you go. Right. Yes, turning to the right sizing policy published in May, can you please provide the panel with more detail on what action has been taken? And here I quote the publication: support the development of new and desirable homes on rezoned housing sites across the country parishes, suitable for those who wish to downsize within their community. I expect it's a difficult question to answer, but
yeah. So I mean, the policy's only just come out and been prepared, so not a huge amount, I think, specifically has gone on there. But obviously, we're anticipating as sites come up that we'll want to look at what's the most appropriate tenure and makeup of the homes on those sites, and that will include some element of right sizing. I'm personally keen to get a feel from parish constables during that process when a place arrives in your patch, which you'll understand better than anyone else, to make sure that you're kind of fed into that process to help give some feedback. But yeah, that there hasn't been a site yet where we have enacted this and gone in and done it.
yeah, well, thanks. I appreciate it's a difficult question. I mean, what it's worth, when publication was made, an elderly parishioner got on to me to say, I would if I could. I mean, but she said, where there are very few on the market locally, and I've been in this community, I want a shop nearby where she was, etc. And there was no real incentive. So I can see that unless there is a special zone site, and Samaria has one, which I need to get hold of the Housing Trust to find out where they are on it. I can see that there are difficulties with these country parishes as to, and the demands for the sites as well, because the other side of the coin, of course, is that parishes want to attract younger people as well.
Indeed, it's got to be a good mix and understanding what the need is at a particular time. At the same time, though, obviously, somebody living in one of the parishes in a large home with lots of empty bedrooms could then if they want to downsize in the parish and in the community that they're happy in and familiar with, then that'll be a younger family, hopefully replacing them in the family home that they've vacated. So that it causes a lot of movement, which can be really positive. But the thing that we were conscious of when we were putting the policy together is that it was not going to focus on penalising people for choosing to live in homes that they're happy with that happen to have lots of spare bedrooms. It wasn't about making people feel guilty for doing that. It was about recognising that when people are deciding what home they want to live in that moment, people have all sorts of calculations that they take into account then. And for some people, you couldn't pay them enough to make them leave their nice multi-bedroomed home in the countryside to live in a small flat in St Helier. They want to live in somewhere that's nice and desirable in the community that they're already well established in. And if you provide nice opportunities like that for those people, it'll then have the knock-on effect of freeing homes elsewhere. So that's not a stick approach, that's a carrot approach. And we were keen to get that across in the policy, that's the ethos behind it.
Yeah, I understand that, and thank you for that. One aspect which perhaps isn't universally recognised is that some of these people who have perhaps outgrown their homes still want the bedrooms there for their grandchildren who aren't living on the island. And it's
cheaper than a hotel. Yeah,
exactly right.
Makes perfect sense. Or you might be a place that has a particularly nice garden and you enjoy dedicating lots of your time to it and sitting in the sunshine and enjoying it, that you wouldn't get with a flat. Everybody's aspirations are different. I know people who did downsize from large family homes. One moved into an over 55s village in St Peter, loved it, great pub, really good bus route, and his best mate lives a few doors down the road, perfectly happy. My mother moved out of her family home, but she was able to do it because she just happened to find a little cottage in town that was angled at such a way that it was quiet, and it has a nice little decking area outside that she can sit in the sun and read a book in. So, she's delighted with what she's found. You can create those opportunities. People will flock to them if that's what they want.
Okay. In a way, you've answered the next question about what discussions have taken place with developers, and you're suggesting not yet.
So for those sites, not yet. That is now part of the policy, so that will be a part of the discussions that happen when they come forward. The exception to that is the SOJDC, where we have had discussions, but that's not for those kind of homes we were just discussing. That is for the apartments. That will suit some people. Some people are very happy with apartment living in town. So for those that do like that, we're working with the SOJDC to make sure that those are part of the mix in what they're building. So
before leaving the county parishes, is there a schedule or plan in place to identify them, to push that forward, so you do have conversations with developers, or is it not a priority at the moment?
I'm not sure something like that's in place at the moment.
So I think a number of developers are starting their conversations, going back to the question before about the rezone sites that are coming forward. So we've got 2, nearly 3 planning applications in, and we've got a number of applications that are undergoing pre-application discussions. I think a lot of it comes down to the insights as to why that site was pursued for rezoning. So we are very aware, in particular, of the parishes where there is a greater desire to achieve right-sizing homes. So that will boil down to working with those sites where it's known. Otherwise, it's when a developer has thought about their site and how they want to bring that forward in partnership with the social housing provider, we can then respond to that and provide advice accordingly. As the policy sets out, there's 2 parts of right-sizing on these sites. There will be the social housing element. That's extremely straightforward. That will be dealt with by the smaller homes that are provided on those sites and doesn't actually require any additional policy mechanism. It's simply the purchase homes that become slightly more hands-on in terms of making sure that the right type of homes and that the Minister is achieving that right balance between affordable housing and homes for people who already have a home who will be downsizing in the community. As he says, it's an important balance that needs to be struck.
Okay, so the moral is to get onto any site developer, really, perhaps privately. Anyway, thank you for that.
Could I just, before we move on to that next question, you mentioned the sites and the rights, and obviously the right-sizing policy does look to the supply of homes. The Minister for the Environment in delivering the Bridging Island Plan has to consider, and his officers have to consider, housing mix and whether it is a correct housing mix. Would you like to see this taken as a material consideration in the determination of planning applications? And are you speaking with the Minister about whether he should adopt supplementary planning guidance built off this to inform better decisions within this plan, rather than just saying this is a problem to be dealt with in the next plan? Do you think you can actually use this to better deliver housing in rural communities on, let's call them windfall sites, sooner rather than later?
I can clarify there's already a policy requirement in the Bridging Island Plan for right sizing, and that's a part driver for why the Minister has published this. So policy H4 it specifically addresses mix, and there was an amendment brought to the Bridging Island Plan that specifically talks to the right sizing issue, so encouraging a mix of homes that will support and enable right sizing. And you have policy H5, which is the affordable housing sites policy, which very specifically talks to right sizing in there as an alternative mix, which is then supported by the Minister for the Environment supplementary planning guidance. So it's this Minister's policy. It already has that established link to the Bridging Island Plan, so this does need to be taken into account when it specifically relates to a policy H5 site. But
only for a policy H5 site, not for generic site within the built-up area of rural communities. So I'm just looking at this and reading. My reading of policy R6 is you're aiming for homes to be provided within rural communities. My reading is you're hoping for this to be beyond just new sites. You might be seeing sites which are ripe for development, and you would like homes to be provided on those sometimes for right sizing. Is that what you'd like to see happen? Is that
I think that's something we'd have to consider.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
Right, yeah. You mentioned already Mr. Jay with his Secretary of Development Company following last week's Assembly decision to ensure the minimum of 50% of homes on any of their sites on the waterfront will be offered to first-time buyers, I'm quoting here, with an assisted purchase product, and a further 50% are designed to encourage right sizing. What evidence do you have that these percentages will meet or perhaps exceed demand?
So those are minimums. So we can scope out closer to the time exactly what the need is, what's viable, and what data we've got to inform that. To be honest, we had been looking at this anyway. Those were conversations that started very early with CEO of the SOJDC to maximise the amounts of homes we're getting from these schemes that meet what broadly we know is a need, and then nail down more finely what that need is. We'd been in discussions about South Hill, about what a right sizing offer there could look like, and there's some exciting stuff that we're in the process of considering. And so when it came up to say the waterfront, well, we already on the waterfront have significant developments that lots of people chose to downsize into, and by all accounts are enjoying it and have a very good standard of living down there. It's just natural to say if we're expanding on that, then there's more that we could do down there. And so what Deputy Miles proposed was perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, so what I get at is really are you expecting a flurry of inquiries now as a result of it, or is it going to stimulate that particular market? Do you have evidence that there is a wealth of people wanting to take advantage of this?
There might have been something in an opinion and lifestyles survey at some point, but I couldn't cite it off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think anecdotally as well, SOJDC do have the insights from their sales programme. They've recently, obviously, sold the Horizon development, and not only the inquiries but also the transactions on that site. It does show that there are a number of right sizers that took the opportunity to move to the waterfront to establish their later years in St Helier.
So you're just waiting to receive inquiry, or JODC wait to receive inquiries, then, are they?
They haven't gone ahead and built these sites yet, so I think in the run-up to that we would also think about promotion for this as a specific offer. The other thing that we've talked about with them is establishing some kind of gateway to ensure that those who are going for these schemes are those who would most benefit from it, so that there may be conditions that are formally attached to it, that you definitely are selling your old home to a growing family, and looking at incomes and that kind of thing to make sure that it benefits those who may not have been inevitably going to do it, but who with a bit of support are more likely to do it. that is early stage about what that gateway might look like, but that might be part of the mix as a way of sifting through who's most appropriate to buy those and how we promote it to them as well.
That gateway, will that be administered by the company or through housing?
So that's to be decided at this point. For the first-time buyer homes, that's slightly easier because we have a gateway for that kind of thing already. So that's kind of easier, but for the downsizers, we still kind of need to work out what's the best way of doing it. And it might not actually be a gateway. It might not be a database of people in the way that the gateway is. It might actually just be a published set of criteria, and when you apply, we just quickly inspect that you do meet those criteria and then accept you. So gateway might not be the appropriate term, but it's that kind of thing.
Sorry, Dave, can I just come in? One thing, I'm just talk about data, and it's a real concern to me, and that is around 50% of the development on the waterfront being first-time buyer, and that's what the proposition, that's what the Assembly's approved. That's around, okay, if we go on the historic numbers, we're talking about 1,000 homes overall down there. That's 500 homes. We've obviously got 15% Les Sablons if it goes ahead. We've got 25% on South Hill. That's a heck of a lot of first-time buyer provision. The concern, and I think that was put in the report, the government report, I think by the economics unit, was there's a real danger that we actually over-provide for first-time buyers, and as a result of that, we actually drive up the cost for people who can't go into the first-time buyer market. What's your take on that one?
I think a surplus of first-time buyer homes is a problem I'd prefer to have than having not enough of them. I think that as a democratic government, we will have the flexibility to pivot if we have to in the future. So if we get to a point where we experience negative distortion in the market because of these kind of schemes, we can at that point change our mind if we've got the evidence.
That would be rescinding the proposition?
It could potentially be, or bringing an alternative proposition that replaces it with something different. But I would not anticipate doing that from the outset. I would, if it ever got to that, and I'd be very surprised if it did. But if it got to that, it might be, Dreamwells. We've built the first 2 blocks and we've solved all the island's problems, and might be on the verge of causing some unintended consequences. Can we alter the 3rd and 4th block of it to counteract that? It might be a case of pivoting at that point. But as I said, an oversupply of first-time buyer homes is a problem I'd like to have.
Could I just check up on that? And this somewhat links into the fact that you've identified you're not a member of the Regeneration Steering Group. And that is the proposition that was approved specifically relates to the suitable type of right-sizing property. Language you've used in your right-sizing policy. Yet you've just referred to your expectation that the housing at the waterfront will be apartment living, pretty much 100%, and will not be the type referred to in the proposition. How do you square whether right-sizing housing mix is suitable down at the waterfront?
Yeah.
If you don't have a say in the RSG, and B, if you've been so keen to look at making sure that the stock is suitable both on new fields and others. So
to be clear, I do think the right-sizing policy does account for apartment living. It's taking into account that some people are happy with apartment living, some people aren't. It's a mix of options within that, and the talk about the sites in the country parishes, that's not going to be tower blocks of apartments. I'm pretty sure, unless something drastically changes in people's desires in the island. But some people like apartment living, and it's obvious that the waterfront would be a place for that. So I don't think it's hinted in that report that it would be anything other than that. And we already have the experience from what's been built down there already, that some people have found them desirable and have had the initiative to go ahead and do their own right-sizing through those sites, so that there is already experience that there is at least some demand out there for that kind of offer.
So, the proposition that was adopted in the report, not the proposition, referenced at least 3 sites that the deputy who brought it wanted to be kind of shown as a consideration. One was Hamid Lemaire, one was L'Hermitage Gardens, and one was Tabor Park. Do you think that the report in that has any material consideration in how you give a steer as Housing Minister as to what the Assembly wanted on that site?
I would be surprised if Deputy Miles meant the physical kind of home. Okay. So, I mean, L'Hermitage Gardens is a lovely, lovely place. It would be a bit out of place plopping a version of that kind of estate on the waterfront. But there's other things that go on there too. There are apartments at L'Hermitage as well, and they have various facilities and supported living and that kind of thing. So that kind of offer, as a similar kind of offer as to what's considered in how a block is built or how facilities are developed. I suspect that was more what she was getting at. Okay.
Yeah, you touched on it already, but going back to the percentages agreed that that's something about availability for the right sizing, etc. I mean, what advice have you received on the impact that these percentages will have on the cost of housing units over a period? The fact that they are going to be made available to these categories, is that going to impact on the cost of the housing units at the waterfront in the future? I mean, and has advice been given on that?
When you say the homes, as in the long-term price projections for the homes that are suggested to be built, or the other homes in the waterfront, that will suddenly find they've got lots more neighbours than previously. Is that what you mean?
Ones, basically. Yeah.
Well, I think the point is to put restrictions on them that suppress the price of those homes more than they would be if they were completely open market. So a proportion of that will be shared equity. So the actual price that people pay at the point of purchase will be discounted from what the open market value would be, and that's the point for those homes. Other homes on there may not be suppressed in their price, but have some other assisted mechanism to support people being able to buy them at their open market price. That, you know, we've talked about deposit saver schemes, for example, or people buying off plan and that kind of thing. But the point of one of the points of homes being first time buyer in perpetuity, which might be part of this mix as well, is that by suppressing the demand, by not allowing investors to come in and buy those homes, just over time, without that extra demand, the price isn't going to go up as much over time, which, again, a problem I'd love to have.
Okay. Again, we do have concerns about the information you have in formulating policies. You've usually stated that you want to focus on the tangible rather than more reports and the gathering of data. I understand why you say that, but how can you be sure that you are meeting actual current and future demand without sufficient data?
Because we do already possess lots of data on lots of areas as well. You know, we already have housing gateways, we already have the assisted purchase pathway, and the developers that are building and selling will have their own data. So that's data that we already have and can draw upon. I've got to be honest, my political style is not to get bogged down in the obtaining new data to tell us things that we ought to be smart enough to know already. I know that lots of young people don't believe they have a prosperous future ahead of them in Jersey because of the cost of housing. I don't need another report to tell me that. I know it already. So that's my style there, and I think we can get on with things, and if the landscape changes, we will pick up on it one way or another, and my efforts are best spent on the things that are going to improve on the things that we already know blindingly obvious need to be improved.
Okay, you do that one. Again, my final question in this area is that you touched on already. You mentioned during the debate you'd already had discussions with SOJDC about what kind of products and incentive mechanisms can be utilised in that to help people who otherwise might not feel it's a viable option for them. Can you provide more detail about the products you're talking about and the mechanisms?
Is this just for right sizing or first time buyers as well?
Both.
Yeah. So there's the ones that are tried and tested that we know work. Shared equity is a good example of that. Shared equity is I was going to say it's the most expensive one to deliver. It's sort of not, but it's the one that means money gets put aside in the largest amounts that you can't then draw upon from it until that buyer eventually sells on or buys the rest of the equity. There's other tried and tested ones as well, deposit saver schemes, and I know that they've been in discussions with financial institutions about what kind of things they can develop with that kind of concept. I'll leave it to them to say more detail on that when they've worked a bit more on it. With right sizing, there are things that they are that the SOJDC could procure more effectively than an individual buyer could. So removal services, for example, if that was part of the package, they could probably do a better deal on it. If they're bulk doing it, then individuals might be able to. Some kind of stamp duty incentive as well for right sizers could be part of that. So there's lots of things that they're looking on.
But so generally speaking, on right, developing the right sizing policy, referencing made previously to things like that, saving a stamp duty for outside, or maybe contribute to legal fees or whatever. Yeah. These are all still in the mix, are they? Or potentially?
The SOJDC as a body can do it. So as a specific offer on a specific site, they can do it if they can find a way of making it work and find a way of getting good value from it. And they are looking at how they might do that. So it's still something that could be on the table for that kind of thing.
Just try, you talk about SOJDC doing that rather than it being
so
policy.
That's not the wider policy, that's specifically for the SOJDC because they are potentially capable of doing it.
Okay, we're going to quickly move on to Affordable Housing Gateway statistics, which Deputy Royal will take.
Sure. So the panel's noted the publication of Affordable Housing Gateway monthly statistics at the 31st of May. The figures show the demand for social rented accommodation has increased by 29, although it remains lower than at this time last year. What impact do you think the widening of eligibility, it's easy if you can say it, criteria had on this increase?
Not a huge amount, I don't think. That is something that I tend to ask for updates on at the Housing Crisis Emergency Task Force, and there's been a number of people who've been coming through because of that, but it's not swarms and swarms of people queuing up. But Heather might have some of the numbers there.
I don't have particular numbers on the impact of the decrease in age, but the Housing Minister is completely right. The demand has not been as much as anticipated. The past month there's been 6 applicants under the age of 30. All have then received ongoing housing advice service support to find appropriate housing. So we anticipate a further decrease towards the end of the year is also not going to be as impactful as anticipated, but the support there on hand for those that don't meet the criteria.
Yeah, okay, that's great. No, and actually that was the point I was coming on to, and that was the dropping of the age to 25, I think, is it September, October planned? Were there any other areas where you might consider widening the gateway eligibility? In other words, income, etc. Or are you going to stick with just dropping the age for now?
So for now, just dropping the age, but everything else remains under constant review. As our economic landscape evolves over time, then over time income limits become devalued from inflation or earnings going up, etc. So that's the kind of thing to keep under constant review and not let it go into abeyance for years and not be readjusted as frequently as it probably ought to be.
Yeah, I think that happened in the past, didn't it? Yeah. Could you provide the panel with your view on whether the right balance is currently being struck by Andean between selling units to allow islanders to pursue home ownership and retaining sufficient social housing stock? And obviously, to a degree, that's also around the timing of the dropping the age to 25. Clearly, there was probably an opportunity there to drop the age to 25 sooner, given there hasn't been the change, and therefore Andean would have more homes to rent, as it were, as opposed to sell. Do you feel you've got the balance right on that?
So I've asked Andium if they can look at their sales and renting figures and what demand they anticipate, because it's not just about the headline numbers, it's also about the types of homes. They might have more people after buying 2 bedrooms, but more people after renting 1 bedrooms, for example. So I have asked them if they can kind of look at that and see if there is a kind of more effective mix they can get to meet those 2 elements of demands without taking away from the other. So I'm still waiting on that. But I have said to them that I am open-minded about the mix. If there is a particular opportunity where a site, for whatever reason, is just not attracting the demand for one particular kind of tenure, then I'm open to looking at converting it to the other type of tenure if they think there could be demand for that as well. But that's something I would want to be evidence-led on that, to make sure that we're not just doing it for the sake of it, and not just doing it for the sake of selling homes to get the money back for them quicker than you would by social rental. I want it to be needs-based rather than based on other kind of pressures.
Okay, and last meeting we talked about Andium have a policy where they have to sell they have a policy of selling 60 homes. You didn't actually have the data to hand last time. Do you know if they managed to sell 60 homes in 2023?
For some reason, I don't think they did, but I could be wrong on that. I don't suppose anyone knows.
No, I don't know if I know.
I don't have the final figures. I know that towards the end of the last year, off my memory, they hadn't yet made all of those sales. They have been, as the Minister says, looking at their sales strategy relative to the rentals. And one thing that they have done recently is move away from the 3-bed sales, which obviously attract a higher price, to the lower sized units, which are seemingly, going okay. So in the changeable market conditions and in light of the supply that's coming, Andium do need to keep their sales programme under constant review, which they are doing. Okay,
all right. I'll leave it at that. Okay, so final question here in this section is, what insight can you provide on whether the numbers of applicants who are categorised as being in urgent need of accommodation when they're accepted onto the gateway has risen or fallen over the last year? That's probably a question for Heather, I think. Heather?
Depends on which way you're looking at it. So partnership pathway that's run through Andium, approximately 40 applicants at the moment are in urgent need. We have, in the region of, at the moment, in band 1, 256 in need, which is a slight increase, but the way that we work the banding is slightly different, and the way we support people is slightly different. We are more preventative. We take preventative action in supporting tenancies and maintaining tenancies as opposed to people being evicted. So it's a very difficult question to ask, because we've made lots of changes to change the landscape of how we support individuals. A slight increase in terms of numbers, but a wide range of support in place to sustain tenancies.
So you feel right now you're comfortable with where you're at the moment in terms of that support?
Comfortable with the support,
with what we're
the
able to offer,
and the opportunities,
Sure.
And the colleagues around us within government working in a much more multi-agency way and much more collaborative in supporting tenancies as well. So very happy.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the last topic, and then we'll let you all escape. The first step scheme. So please could you provide the panel, Minister, with any update on the first step scheme since the launch of the second tranche of funding?
It's going great. That's the headline. So it is going great. There has been a good amount of demand. We can give you, and it might be more useful in written form, but we can give you a breakdown of numbers in terms of the types of homes that people have been applying for and buying, what their incomes were, what their household makeup was. So from the first round, I have noticed that the largest grouping are people in their 20s, which I'm really pleased with, and also people on relatively lower incomes as well, £20,000 to £40,000 incomes in many instances as well. So it is helping younger and more lower income people into home ownership, which is very pleasing, exactly the kind of thing I wanted. One thing that we didn't experience much of in the first tranche, which we did make some slight modifications for the second tranche, was in that first tranche, it really was mostly 1 and 2 bedroom apartments and less so 3-bedroom homes. And the thing that struck out to me in the figures is that the number of children who would be housed through the scheme was relatively low in the first tranche. And so I thought, right, just so we get an experience of a mix of types of homes and households being helped, we modified things slightly for the second tranche so that it would be more likely that slightly bigger families and slightly bigger homes as well would be more likely to get through that. So applications for the second tranche are closed at the moment, but I'm kind of hoping that some of that might be a bit more family home as opposed to small apartment as it was first time round. And seeing how that goes, we can then have a look at tranche 3 and see, is there a further mix that needs to be thrown in, or can we modify it again just to see what happens and see what kind of people come forward.
Okay, that's really interesting, because you told the panel previously you didn't anticipate a change, but it sounds like you've been quite proactive in spotting things. So are there any other things, as you mentioned, looking forward to tranche 3 in September, I presume?
Yep.
That you see might be modified, tweaked or changed, that you've learnt from tranche 1 and now obviously the ongoing learnings of tranche 2?
So one little thing that we noticed from tranche 1 was the expectations of people who were successful in the homes they were then going out to bid on. I think there wasn't perhaps as great clarity as there could have been on the fact that this is for secondary market homes. It's for homes that people have lived in. It's not for new builds, and it's not for conversions, or it's not intended to be for conversions if they're reasonably drastic and haven't had people living in them before and aren't unlocking a chain. So I think there were a couple of instances where there had been homes that were conversions by developers, not the people who were living in them, who kind of didn't realise that wasn't really what it was about, and there was not as much clarity as there could have been on that. So I think for the third tranche, we will probably communicate that a bit more effectively, because it's better use of that public money if it's going towards buying a home that's going to unlock another purchase further on down the line and get things moving. It's just better value for money for that. So we might probably try and communicate that a bit better.
So that example is so a property split into 3 flats does not qualify under the scheme, and that's some of the clarity that people have had to have. Okay.
Yes.
And you see the twin benefits, there being a benefit of unlocking chains of those living in it.
Yeah.
And you hope to see success in that.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
So any analysis has been drawn from the fact that of the 125 applications received, 24 result in applicants being offered loans? Is there anything you've taken from that?
So I think 25 were initially offered and subsequently 2 dropped out for various personal reasons. A large number, I don't know if I can find what that number is, but there were a lot of people who applied who were unsuccessful purely because of the demand, not because they weren't eligible or not because they wouldn't potentially be right for the scheme, but just they were unlucky that time round. So what that showed was that there was more demand for that first tranche than we were aiming to meet that first time round, which in a sense is a good thing, because it showed that there were people who saw it and were interested and excited enough to go through the effort of applying. And that does kind of help me say, okay, when we did it, there was demand. So if we do it again, there will probably also still be demand. So let's see what happens there. So that was a sign to me that it was popular, and that it is the kind of scheme that was desirable for a number of people, more than we were able to accommodate. Which, in fairness, I think we probably would have presumed that would happen. It's not a surprise.
Did you have you seen any impact, or have an understanding of the impact that high interest rates and deposit requirements have had on applicants?
Not necessarily, because the deposit requirement was clear and upfront from the start. If there were people who that was a problem, they probably weren't applying in the first instance. I think there actually was a small number who did apply anyway, and then got told, no, that it is clear that the deposit is part of it. I've been trying to communicate with the people, just a small number of people who privately contact me, saying, the deposit requirement was an issue for us here, to say, the home buy scheme from Antium doesn't have a deposit requirement. So, there are a mix of schemes that can be available. Some will require deposits, some won't. So, people managed it, and people are buying homes now through the scheme. They are going through the Royal Court. So for those people, it was okay.
Great. And you mentioned about those who were unsuccessful in the first tranche. Could you just clarify, just for any applicants or people listening, that should they wish to take part in now the third tranche, those in the first and second will have to reapply? Is that the case?
Indeed, they were all emailed to be told that, and a number of them have reapplied for the second tranche, but some will be, of course, free to do so in the third one as well.
Brilliant. And finally, just looking at the coming up on the time, and thank you for 2 hours of your time, Minister and officers. Looking at reflecting on the online information and the kind of the access to the eligibility criteria. You've touched on this, but have changes now been made to make anything clearer on making sure those who want to apply have really clear advice as to what they can apply for? Are there any lessons from that?
I'm worried at you asking the question, because I didn't think there was. I was pleased with the website. I thought the process was okay, and I think that there are some improvements in communication that could probably be made after people have applied. So that point about converted properties is one that probably requires a few more words in there to be clear on that. But I thought the website was pretty good and pretty clear. I'm worried you might be about to tell me it's not.
Well, if we find anything, Minister, we'll share it with you.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, I think we will end the public